Worcester's Cathedral Church was built between the 11th and 16th centuries and has stood for almost an entire millennium. But long before construction had even begun on the present building, not one, but two cathedrals stood simultaneously on the same site, forming the symbolic seat of the Anglo Saxon bishops of Worcester. So what do we know about these forgotten churches, and of the bishops who sat there? And does anything remain of them today? This is the story of Worcester's lost Saxon cathedrals. It's easy for us to overlook the Anglo-Saxon history of Worcester Cathedral. After all, pay a visit to the site today and you'll find virtually no physical evidence of either of the pre-Norman churches which once stood on the same site. And yet, for 4 entire centuries before the present cathedral existed, Worcester had been the seat of a bishop, home to the cathedral churches of St. Peter and St. Mary, as well as a Benedictine priory. Moreover, it was during this period that the bishops of Worcester enjoyed the height of their powers. They were able to shape and define a city which grew around their institution in a way which is still recognisable today, and in some cases, were able to influence the course of the whole of English history. Worcester's Anglo-Saxon bishops were hugely influential figures, many acting as key advisors to royalty in both religious and secular matters. The sway they held in national politics would rarely again reach the same levels after the Norman conquest. So in this film, we'll take a look at those lost early centuries of the cathedral story, and examine the evidence to see what, if anything, remains of the former churches today. Worcester Cathedral was founded at the end of the 7th century, when the growing Anglo-Saxon Church appointed several new bishops. At this time, the settlement was part of a minor Anglo-Saxon kingdom, ruled by a people known as the Witcher. Historians are divided on the matter of why Worcester was chosen to be the site of a new cathedral. Some argue that Worcester was already an important centre of Christianity prior to the Wiccan settling of the area. Others have suggested that the see was founded by the kings of Mercia, who chose Worcester for its close proximity to the Mercian border, thus offering them some form of political leverage over their Wiccan neighbours. The early diocese of Worcester covered a wide area, thought to have included parts of Worcestershire, Gloucestershire and Warwickshire, which may have corresponded with the territorial boundaries of the Wiccan kingdom. The first bishops here were known as Episcopus Wicchorum, the bishops of the Wisher. The first bishop to take up office at Worcester was a man called Bozel. Although little is known of Bozel, Worcester's Royal Grammar School claims that it can trace its roots back to a school he founded shortly after his consecration. If this is true, then it would make Worcester home to the 6th oldest school anywhere in the world. The 7th and 8th centuries were a period when the cathedral and its bishops became extremely wealthy, mostly through the accrual of land obtained via royal grants. An 18th century text held in the cathedral library records a number of royal charters from this period, which show that the cathedral and its bishops were granted lands at Hanbury, Fladbury, Wychbold, Ombersley, Shottery, Old Barrow, Woodchester, Salwarp, Wick, Purton, Dowton, Cropthorne, Itchcombe and Aston, and these are just a few examples whose words have survived to the present day. You can find examples of land once owned by the bishops in modern names of places close to the cathedral. Take, for example, the land on the west bank of the Severn at Worcester. Until relatively recently, the area was known as Wick Episcopi, or Bishop's Wick. This large land grant was made to the cathedral by the great Mercian king Offa in the mid-8th century. Place names within this territory, such as Henwick, provide us with examples of how the cathedral made use of its lands. This amassing of wealth and power via land ensured that Worcester's early bishops played a key role in the administration and development of the city. In the late 9th century, Bishop Wertherf was consecrated. He was a friend of King Alfred the Great, helping the king in his mission to translate important texts from Latin to English, in an attempt to spark a literary renaissance in the Anglo Saxon world. This is recorded by Alfred's contemporary biographer, the monk Asa. Towards the end of the century, Wertherf requested that Worcester be refortified to protect both the citizens and the cathedral from raiding Danes. By this time, Worcester had been absorbed into the Kingdom of Mercia. Mercia was ruled jointly by Alfred's daughter Ethelfled and her husband Ethelred, who together issued Wertherf a charter granting him the right to refortify the city. The issuing of this charter was hugely influential in the growth of the settlement. The early Anglo-Saxon defences, thought to have been based upon the late Roman ramparts, were extended far to the north and east to include a much wider area. This refounding of Worcester led to its increased regional significance as a place of trade and commerce, and laid the blueprint for the later medieval city. Today, Worcester can be described as a picturesque cathedral city bustling with shops and markets, an identity the city gained more than 1,000 years ago, and owing to the presence of its cathedral and enterprising early bishops. One of Worcester's most important Anglo-Saxon bishops was Oswald. Alongside his predecessor Dunstan, Oswald was a leading figure in the revival of Benedictine monasticism. He helped to lead an ecclesiastic revolution which would shape the face of Worcester and indeed medieval society for centuries to come. In the late 10th century, Oswald founded a Benedictine priory at Worcester. To house the new community, he constructed a second cathedral church dedicated to St. Mary alongside Bosel's Church of St. Peter. Tradition in Worcester claims that Oswald also founded a monastic hospital to the north of the city, which still bears his name today, though this theory is disputed by modern historians. In 972, Oswald became the Archbishop of York, a post he held simultaneously with the bishopric of Worcester. He was held in high esteem by his contemporaries and those who came after him. After his death, he was canonized as a saint, and his remains were enshrined in one of Worcester's cathedrals. Oswald had died in 992, but the priory he founded remained at Worcester for nearly 6 centuries, only succumbing to the dissolution of the monasteries in the reign of Henry VIII. In the Anglo-Saxon period, it was a nationally important centre of learning, and the work carried out in its scriptorium was one of the few ways that information was copied and disseminated at that time. The monks of Oswald's priory also played a key role in recording history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle forms the single most important source for historians studying the period today, and it was partly written by the monks at Worcester. The main author of the Worcester text is known to us as John of Worcester. It's believed that John was ordered to compile his chronicle on the orders of another of the great Anglo-Saxon bishops of Worcester, Wulfstan. Like Oswald, Wulfstan was famed across England for his piety and devotion. He had been prior of the monastery at Worcester before he was appointed as bishop in 1062. His lifetime witnessed perhaps the single most important event in English history, the Norman Conquest. Wulfstan had been a close confidant and advisor to King Harold Godwinson, who was defeated by Duke William of Normandy at the Battle of Hastings. He managed to hold on to his office as bishop following the crowning of now King William, at a time when most Saxon officials were being replaced by Norman counterparts. At William's coronation on Christmas Day in 1066, it was Wulfstan's predecessor as Bishop of Worcester, Eldred, who placed the crown atop the conqueror's head. Wulfstan's piety is said to have impressed William, who allowed him to retain his post as bishop. He therefore represents a living bridge between the lost Saxon cathedrals of Worcester and the present structure, which dates to the early Norman period. Indeed, it was Wulfstan who was responsible for beginning the construction of the cathedral as we know it, work on which began in 1084 with the crypt, which remains largely intact to this day. Sadly, this meant the destruction of the existing cathedral churches built by Basil and Oswald. Watching Oswald's Church of St. Mary being pulled down, Bishop Wulfstan is said to have openly wept. So why did this happen? There are several possible reasons. By the end of the 11th century, the priory at Worcester had ballooned in size from a community of 12 monks to some 50. So it could be that the older buildings were simply not big enough to accommodate such a large community. On top of this, both St. Mary's and St. Peter's are thought to have been badly damaged when Worcester was attacked earlier in the century. Lastly, it's possible that Wulfstan was pressured to rebuild the cathedral by the Norman crown for political reasons. In reality, each one of these factors probably contributed to the decision to replace the existing churches. So the question remains, can we pinpoint exactly where the two cathedrals once stood? And what do we know about their appearances? The shorthand answer is that we know next to nothing, though there are theories which carry some weight. Both churches are thought to have been built somewhere close to the present cathedral, though archaeologists have yet to uncover any evidence which may reveal their exact locations. Basil's Church of St. Peter was probably a relatively small building at first. We're not even sure if it was constructed in stone or wood, but as it was known to be standing in the 11th century, it seems likely to have been a stone structure from the outset. Oswald's Church of St. Mary was likely a larger structure, almost certainly built in stone, which probably included buildings for the accommodation of its monastic inhabitants, such as cloisters and sleeping quarters. A top-down view of the modern cathedral reveals that the old monastic refectory is in slight misalignment with the main body of the church. An Anglo Saxon lay cemetery is also known to have been situated just to the east of this building, beneath the present chapter house. This has led some historians to suggest that the Cathedral of St. Peter may lie in the area of the present cloisters and refectory. It's possible that Oswald's Church of St. Mary lies beneath the area occupied by the nave of the present cathedral. We know that when Bishop Wulfstan began building his church in the late 11th century, work started with the crypt and the eastern end. Only once these parts were completed could St. Mary's be pulled down, as the monks had still needed somewhere to live, so it would make sense that Oswald's church was in this area. Tantalisingly, some of the masonry in the present cathedral appears to be Anglo-Saxon in origin, and may have been reused from the earlier churches, or even left standing and absorbed into the later structure, though this is yet to be proven. The fact is that until we uncover firm archaeological evidence, we can't say with any certainty exactly where the two Anglo-Saxon cathedrals lay, but it is widely agreed upon that they lie somewhere close to Wulfstan's church. Wulfstan died in 1095, the last surviving Anglo-Saxon bishop in all England. Like Oswald before him, he was eventually canonised as a saint and his remains enshrined in the cathedral. With his death, one of the last vestiges of Worcester's Saxon cathedrals also died. The history of Worcester's Anglo-Saxon Cathedral, its bishops and its priory are often overlooked in popular histories. Yet this was the time when the bishops of Worcester were at the height of their powers. They influenced the course of both local and national history, and some were on first-name terms with towering figures of the English historical canon. Today, scant traces of their legacy can be spotted across Worcester. More than 120 years after the death of Worcester's last Anglo-Saxon bishop, King John asked to be buried at the cathedral between the shrines of Oswald and Wulfstan, proving that their influence remained potent long after their mortal remains had decayed. In 1984, excavations beneath Wulfstan's crypt produced a single piece of decorated rubble. Believed to be a surviving fragment from one of the earlier cathedrals, it proves that the present structure stands over the obliterated remains of the Anglo-Saxon world it replaced, a world which may in many ways remain lost to us forever.